think now we'll start today's event, and I think all the audience are Tibetan, so I will pay my greetings by saying very Nyuhung Delek and good evening, especially I can see our the department's additional secretary, Mr. Tenzin Exile, also came here. Thanks for that. Yeah, and I'm Sering Norpo, the Tibetan Museum staff, and I'm very happy to hosting these events. And if I talk a little bit about why we are hosting such kind of events, just brief about the background of these events. It's like since like the Tibet Museum, it like falls under the Department of Information and International Relations, and especially under the Department of Information, where the information divisions of the DIR primarily works towards the proclaiming or spreading the information about the political, human rights, and the environmental condition in Tibet, and to the Tibetan people, and also the world community at large, and keep the Tibetan issue alive, and also like spreading to raise awareness about the Tibet current situation, and also pass how Tibetans people have gone through the difficulties and all these things, to raise awareness about all these things. So we've been hosting this kind of like talk series, a minimum at least twice a month. So today I'm very grateful and honored to have the speaker of the events, Dr. Kaveri Jila. So if I talk a little bit about Madam, so it's like Madam Kaveri Ji is currently as a professor head of the Department of International Relations and then Governance Studies of the University of Sheikh Nadar, which is there in the Delhi, NCR. And then her undergraduate and doctoral and the postdoctoral work was at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom, and also where the Madam held the Smooths like fellowship at the Center of the South Asian Studies and bi-fellowship at the Queen's College while teaching at the same time. And also Madam has published widely, especially including in the area of waste, and also specifically over here with recent empirical work in the Himalayas, and also an emerging focus in both teaching and research. So Madam has been is the refugee predicament, or I should say embarrassing situation of the statelessness and its multiple correlates, and also with specific reference to the Tibetan, with the and also with very closely affiliated with the Tibet House, New Delhi. Currently, recently Ma'am has completed her master's in Nalanda master's course in the Buddhist philosophy, and I'm sure some other day Ma'am will have, if time permits, Ma'am will also give us some teachings. So also like that, and also Ma'am has served almost almost period of almost 1 year as the principal of the Dalai Lama Institution for Higher Education, which is over there in the Bangalore University from the year 21 to 22, and something like that. So without taking much time, I would like to hand over the session to Madam, please. And Madam will talk on especially talk on this topic for 40 minutes, and after that we have 10 minutes of a question answer session, and after that we have also a tea break. Everyone will have to please take that, and kindly Madam will start your session.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Tashi Dele, and it's a real delight to be here. And I want to thank Tibet Museum, DIIR, the director Tenzin Toptin, and Senonla for all the help given to me. I'm actually just struck by the beauty of this museum, and the beauty, but also a very mixed feeling, in the sense that I had visited the old Tibet Museum when it was near Sukrakhang, and of course one leaves there with a complete sense of devastation, seeing all the events of 1959 and just before that. And now to come to this museum, which is truly international standard, not Indian standard, international, and it comprehensive history and so many facets of Tibetan culture, traditions, history. So it's really moving to see, and I have to come back tomorrow to complete my tour. So I want to preface my talk by saying that I am no expert on Tibet. Actually, as Senonla said, my introduction to interest in Tibet was really through Dharma. It is through Buddhist philosophy that I have come to the developing an affinity, and also my area, although I'm head of department of an international relations and governance studies, I am not a political scientist by training. I'm really an economist or a political economist. So I want to just set that out there, because when I was invited to speak, I was thinking about what to talk about. And this is an area that this opportunity has given me a lot to think about. And I am also, of course, introducing a course on refugees with specific respect to Tibetans next term in my university. So it is also in that context that I'm thinking through things and interested in the structural questions and the political economy questions more than specifically the questions of course, being a refugee, citizenship, exile, identity, all of that, So with that preface, so my central argument here is really about assimilation. And I have used the word assimilation very consciously. So if we take assimilation to mean the loss of one's distinct identity of culture, language, religion, and traditions by requiring minorities/refugees to adopt those of the colonial power dominant group host country. So I put out these various slashes because I'm also talking about what is happening, of course, to Tibet by the Chinese, but I'm also talking about, Tibetans in exile. Chinese assimilationist policies and education in Tibet by design, and I don't need to go into this here. I was just looking at the last part of this museum, and there's really nothing to say, but to say that they are overt, they are coercive, they are increasingly aggressive, though they have always been at some level, with the complete erasure of Tibetan identity and indoctrination from a young age. And I refer here to the most recent work on colonial boarding schools for Tibetan children and all the coercion that is involved in that step. Now I talk about Tibetans in exile. I talk about, of course, India, if what the term means would be India, Nepal, Bhutan, and increasingly all the Tibetan diaspora which is settled in the West and elsewhere, which has inherited the unique responsibility to preserve, protect, and reproduce Tibetan identity in all its facets above. And this was recognized very shortly after 1959, and it has been incorporated into the makeup of education systems in exile. So at this juncture in time, now in 2022, what I call this preemptive resistance to de facto assimilation by default. And this is what I'm talking about as regards Tibetans in exile, which might be due to changing demographics, what I call double displacement in the form of out-migration to the West, and various other factors, some of which are exogenous. So what are the achievements and the challenges then in Tibetan education in exile? And when I talk about Tibet, I do talk about the three provinces of Amdo, Kham, and Utsa. So now the remit of this lecture, my knowledge is really about Tibetans in exile in India and not other regions. When I'm talking about education, formally, I am touching upon schools with, TCV, the Tibetan Homes Foundation, Sambota schools, which have now absorbed the CTSA schools, the modern higher education institutions for Tibetans, and the scholarly Tibetan Buddhist monastic institutions, where my knowledge is really of the major Gelug scholastic monasteries in the south. This is just due to my empirical understanding, not any a priori selection. And my focus is going to be a little bit more on higher education, both modern and monastic, because that's really what I have the best knowledge of, in the sense of having been the principal at the Dalai Lama Institute and also engaging closely with Tibetan Buddhist institutions in exile. When I talk about tradition and modernity, it's really at two levels. One is the formal, where there's a tendency to have a simple binary of tradition being equated with the monastic and the modern with the rest. But I'm also going to talk about informal elements and markers. For example, the unquestioning respect for a teacher in a pedagogic system, which is very much a kind of a marker of a traditional system, and also things like certification and all, which are markers of the modern system. And the synthesis aspect is going to look at crossover characteristics of both within the formal systems. Now, there is a unique historic centrality of tradition to Tibetan identity and education. And in fact, walking through this museum, I could even have foregone this slide altogether. But I just want to say that, you know, of course, the origin of the Tibetan language itself is bound up with dharma. Of course, the spiritual and temporal aspect going hand in hand, that's also there. Then the language itself is created in a context of trying to convey dharma meanings directly. And you can see that in, you know, how important His Holiness's many messages, that the kind of, you know, preservation of Tibetan language, even for the study of dharma, is very, very critical. And of course, you have the high language of the pechas and everything, and the colloquial everyday language. There is that distinction. Before 1959, education was most extensive and systematized in the context of monasteries. Outside of it, it would have been, in my understanding, you know, more like sort of privatized, or there may be religious education, but sort of informal, bilateral, or other kinds of systems, not really a universal education system. And also Tibet's tradition prior, so from the 7th to the 14th, 15th centuries, the coming up of the printing, you know, wood block printing and all, also is very, very closely related to the religious aspect. And I also want to set out one thing here, the unique centrality of modernity to the Tibetan religious tradition. And I say this because I often think a lot, we are sitting in India, how, you know, the Buddhist philosophy, there are parts of it, and including the monastic tradition, that is in fact very modern and very accessible. And I say that because when you look at things like debate being a central part of the pedagogy, or you look at emptiness as a concept, I think it is really, of course it's related to the Buddha's teachings, but you know, it can be taken in a very secular context as well, and therefore there is that element as well. And this is very distinct from, you know, religious and tradition in, I would say, in many other traditions, including in India. Now, Tibetan education in exile is initially seen, it's an immediate need, and one that is seen as being very temporary and time-bound. And of course, Tibetans come to India where, you know, we are already have an old established history of colonial education policies based on Macaulay's famous Minute on Indian Education. And in fact, the critique of the present dispensation about Nehru's India, about people like myself who may be called Macaulay's children, is precisely this, that we are a product of a Western curriculum, English as the medium of instruction. And I will come back to this right at the end when I talk about the dangers of preserving Tibetan language, because to be honest, for somebody like me and a lot of my age group, English is our first language. There is no second language, and we cannot really read or write in it beyond a very cursory level. So what does that mean? That is something that, you know, I will come back to the end when I talk about the assimilation by default, the risk of that. And then of course, in the aftermath of 1959, the belief is, and it's a very understandable one, that exile is temporary. So of course, you know, it's seen that, you know, the education of children and monastics is seen as an immediate priority, but one that is not expected to last for decades, right? So the schools for children are set up pretty much immediately, and then the lamas of all traditions are sent to Buxa, and then slowly, you know, you have this notion of adding modern higher education institutions, and then the lamas being settled in various monasteries in the south and elsewhere. So this gradual and shifting time horizon is reflected in a finer articulation of the vision of Tibetan education in exile and its planning. But the goal always remains, and it remains to date, of this being practiced for a full-fledged education policy back in the 3 provinces of Tibet. I I quote from His Holiness, about this idea of weaving tradition and modernity in Tibetan education in exile. There is no doubt, despite the current leniency, that we in exile are much better off than our friends and relatives in Tibet. Here we have absolute freedom to go wherever we like, do whatever we like, and practice every aspect of our religion and traditions without fear of censure from any quarter. Most important of all, our younger generations have at their disposal all the modern educational facilities of the free world. They can learn whatever they are interested in or whatever they feel will contribute something worthwhile to their community, whereas what passes for education in Tibet, still to this day, and he's talking in 1981, is what the authorities decide is good for them. This, I feel, is one of the worst aspects of the Chinese rule in Tibet, this lack of real education. Children of today are the makers of the future society. If the future of our society is in any way to be meaningful in terms of our being a member of the world community, then they must have a modern education, conducive to a cosmopolitan outlook of life, as well as being familiar enough with their own culture and tradition in order to retain their distinct identity. So there's a series of official conferences that are then held by the Department of Education at the CTA. And in the meantime, the architecture of Tibetan education in exile keeps becoming more sophisticated and expanding. So you have separate schools, and then I'm not going into them, but then, when they come up, what are the differences, English being the first language, then subsequently Tibetan, and all of those kind of moves. In terms of modern higher education institutions, you have the coming up of various institutions that happen slowly, and the complete and faithful reproduction of monastic education institutions in exile. Then the formal articulation of a vision for Tibetan education in exile happens with the basic education policy for Tibetans in exile in 2005. And here it is very, very clear that there is an idealistic foundation. So as His Holiness has said, there is a distinct move to combine, Buddhist philosophical precepts with the whole purpose of education. And of course, Venerable Samdong Rinpoche's imprint also on this basic education policy is very strong. I won't go into that now, but even Gandhian notions and other kinds come into this. When you read this document, it's a very interesting document of how education is seen. And the purpose itself also is, as it sets out here, to preserve and promote the unique wealth of Tibetan culture and traditions, which are now seen of great value to the whole of humanity. So they are not just thinking about Tibetans in exile. And of course, there's a wish to contribute, to ideas of universal responsibility and all of that. And in terms of the system of education, the goal is explicitly set out right in 6.1, where they talk about the system of education having traditional Tibetan education at its core and modern education as its essential co-partner to be implemented. And here I want to just say that, this goal itself is remarkable when we think about it in other contexts. And I would also like the audience to reflect that today in India, perhaps there are certain discussions happening on, going in the opposite direction. And the national education policy also kind of allows for that in many ways. And we see the introduction of English being seen coming in much later in primary education, although that was our so-called competitive advantage in the world and all of that. So this notion of combining the tradition and the modern is something that is really quite challenging as in any kind of education system, I would say. And the achievements here, I have to say, are really down to the ultimate cosmopolitan visionary and modernizer that is His Holiness. And I'm not saying that as, my personal beliefs is one thing, but I've actually been reflecting on this question a lot since I went down south to be principal. And I've been thinking about it in the context of, even preparing for this talk. And why do I say that? Because, I'll explain about that later as well, but this notion of, his emphasis on trying to get English as an education medium, his emphasis on taking universal secular ethics, which for me is really Buddhist philosophy without the term Buddhist, to the whole world, is, it's an extraordinary vision. And so right away, and then when you look at the size of this refugee community and the circumstances of 1959 and thereafter, straight away it's not even just about protecting and about the survival of Tibetan community in exile or the Tibetan community back in Tibet, but it's about taking on responsibility for a much wider, in fact, the whole of humankind, right? And I won't go into that, but the foundation of Ume Lam and many other things is also related to this perspective, which I think, is quite extraordinary. And then the goals, I would say in my view, for Tibetan schooling and monasteries have more than been met. And this is shown in the fact that Tibetans do choose to send their children to Tibetan schools where possible, even today in all contexts. And I've been in situations where Tibetan schools are not available, and then they don't really have many staff with children of school-going age. So that, as an economist would say, the demand shows, the popularity of this. And I would also say that, Tibetan monasteries have basically rejuvenated education in the whole Himalayan region. And I would say the goal for Tibetan modern higher education is a work in progress, but there's a lot of achievements there as well. Now this linguistic identity again, it has been preserved against all the odds of colonized countries. And I am also speaking here as a product of a colonized country and as a further generation of that, even as the role of English is acknowledged in the modern world. And therefore is being promoted even amongst monastics, right? His Holiness is the one who wants Geshe Larampas of a very high quality to learn English. And why is that? Because he's thinking of their reach and kind of, ability to influence institutions and other fora apart from their traditional monasteries. And I would also say that the financial support, autonomy for education, including from the Government of India, and the overall great physical infrastructure of institutions, which by the way does not imply that there was a lot of monetary support for them, but that Tibetans have a unique skill of taking something with less means, producing something that is very spectacular in terms of, and very beautiful. And this Tibet Museum is an example, case in point. But if you see all the institutions across the south and how others in the region might perceive those settlements now in 2022, when you read the history of how they were built and from what they were built, you can see that there's this particular, I feel, a uniquely Tibetan kind of a thing, it's. So in terms of modern schooling, and as I say, this is the area I know the least about firsthand really, but I would say that basically the achievements that have been achieved is the very difficult goal of synthesizing tradition and modernity. Through language, religion, traditions, all of that being preserved in these schools. As I said, it is the preferred choice even today for Tibetan parents in exile, and that is not just linked to the monetary, that they might be more affordable and all of this. It is really linked to trying to inculcate in their children a sense of Tibetan identity, which they feel that they can't do alone at home. Then the numbers of Tibetans in exile that have gone through the system, they have created an infrastructure across Tibetan settlements. And of course, even the affordability is a big issue when you look at the privatization of education systems in India, right? Both primary and higher education. And what does that mean for access and all of that? Now the challenges, of course, and some of these, as I said at the start, are really exogenous. That of course, preserving linguistic identity and this 3-language formula that they use comes at some cost to the quality of language proficiency. And this is both in Tibetan and English and especially written. And here I would say that, the Tibetans in exile, there's a further kind of an issue. Number one, those who are coming in from Tibet right up until 2008, then they are coming with Mandarin and they are coming at different levels. They are also accommodated into the system. The second thing is, like, for instance, down south now, if they have policies to forcibly force people to basically do regional languages, even at the higher education level, for example, Kannada, that would add another dimension to this. But here at the moment, of course, then the quality of education with respect to competitive excellence suffers, because there is that time that is devoted over the years to learning Tibetan, or for instance, now I understand it that English is only going to be taught from primary school onwards, and until then it is only Tibetan, right? And then you have up until you sit your competitive exams at the end of school. And you have classes for, Buddhist philosophy and other things. So when you look at that, obviously the competitive advantage, there is that element. And this is an issue where practically speaking, we all who live in the post-Fordist era, education is seen as being instrumental to get a job. And again, this is something that the basic education policy absolutely sees as not, the case. Their main purpose is again very exalted. It's seen as achieving temporary and long-term benefit for self and others. Again, a Mahayana principle, and again one that we could debate, because of course historically the Greeks and others have had this notion that the intrinsic value of education and literacy and all of that. But the challenge is then in language. If you think about livelihood as also being something that is important for Tibetan youngsters in the future, then that is one challenge. Changing demographics and declining numbers since 2008, and the taking in of Himalayan students, and what that implies for linguistic training also within the schools themselves, right? Because you may then have children coming in from different, although Bhutia and the whole family of languages, there is that element, but still they may come in with other kinds of criteria and what that means for pedagogy and all in school. And then of course the salaries for staff and, the lack of guidance perhaps for some career and everything. Now the modern higher education, what are the achievements and challenges? I think the achievements are very clearly that the goal has been met of providing teaching of Tibetan specialized subjects in Tibetan. So we talk about literature, language, history, philosophy, all of these, and I think traditionally that was considered the 4 areas of what makes up cohesive degree in Tibetan studies, so to speak. There is also the offering of regular subjects at some of these higher education institutions. There is a very high quality of education at some. For example, IBD Dharamsala has a very highly acknowledged level of education, even though the infrastructure is necessarily straining at the seams. There's full funding for such options. And it's basically created an option of an extended holy Tibetan environment that goes into now the higher education domain. And now the challenges, of course, and some of them stem from the historical, way that all of this has unfolded in exile, is that there is no cohesive plan for modern higher education for Tibetans in exile. And you see this lacunae even in the basic education policy, and generally it is more focused on the schooling element. And there is not that much engagement or at all on the common curriculum, systematic interactions between these various institutions. In some instances, there's no formal accreditation and certified degrees despite very high quality education. So what that means is that people from IBD and all may have to go on and then get a double PhD, which is actually just for the certification, because the knowledge they have got at IBD is far greater than what they are likely to ever get anywhere else internationally. Where they are affiliated to regular Indian universities, and that brings with it a host of problems. And so even at our university, we debate UGC, non-UGC, all this, and all of that. But what happens is that there is a lack of knowledge and understanding of the conventions of modern education, right? And Kunzob is Kunzob. Everything has to be its own convention, So some things like continuity of batches for degrees or record keeping or all of that. And there is a danger that, rather than being both traditional and modern, one could be neither. The other thing that of course comes out of this, the emphasis on schooling, is that the grafting of school systems and staff onto higher education. They have extended that 3 years to 3 years. I think they made it from, that was also done expressly with a certain thinking. The introduction of sutra teaching in tantric colleges, Gurme, Gyuto, I don't think they had that before. This is again very, very conscious. Then the modernization and accreditation is going further. I think Sarah J has already got or is in the process of getting affiliation to Mysore University and the founding of a full Gelug University and all of that. And of course, they've rejuvenated the entire Himalayan Buddhism in the direction of scholasticism and modernism, not superstition. This is a fact. The challenge is, of course, is that His Holiness's wish to see, and this is the visionary aspect, right? I don't see many religious people who are going to try and have such kind of visions that possibly, reduce the power of their own institutions. But that is His Holiness for you. So the wish to see Geshe Larampas of a very high quality train in English and to be able to teach in that is, I think, so far a project that needs further realization. Again, there is the changing demographics and declining numbers. And when the physical infrastructure has really been created, for modest means in settlements, but is just extremely impressive. And I think here of the Panchen Lamas, Tashi Lungpo, if any of you have visited Balakupe recently, my word, it's just beautiful and also, waiting for activities to which even the library and all is really very impressive. Of course, these exogenous factors like technological distractions of the modern age to monastic life and the continuity, the digital archiving of materials, and in this museum, it's a good thing to say here that, like the way work that has been done here, I think some of the younger monastics share with me that they have material like oral, very rare archives from their teachers, and the translation projects are also very, very not complete. The great past teachers in exile, or the Vatsa Lamas and others. So I think the overall exogenous challenges, and this is why I use the word assimilation by default at the beginning, and I look forward to rebuttal and lots of argumentation, and I'm a bit hesitant to put it in this, but I have used that because I am really talking about some factors which might be larger than the Tibetan struggle per se. So the number one is keeping alive the Tibetan language. And again, I relate this to the point that when there's been colonization, as is, has happened to Tibet and sitting in India where we are also a product of that, this, the necessity to keep the language alive, but also the challenges there, this is something that needs careful thinking and particularly as I feel that the activities of China in Tibet today are ensuring that basically it is the community in exile on who this responsibility rests. And so that is a significant, challenge. Intergenerational differences, I'm very, very amused is not the right word, but intergenerational differences are there in all communities, right? And now that is grafted onto the refugee status. So and then coming again from an Asiatic, context. So of course we have a particular kind of, there's much respect for elders, there's a certain experience and everything that they bring. But at the same time, I think every generation, younger ones are wanting to do things their way. They may go in certain directions and there may be, outward, whether it's dress, chuba wearing, hair coloring, all those things, and to slightly deeper, issues. But then I think the kind of, the kind of understanding between generations, and then also as the leadership and everything changes and the inheriting of all of that part is, something that is also there. The diasporic double displacement. Again, my family of birth, I'm from the Sikh community, so all Punjabis are migrating. I have migrated, we have a lot of it in our communities. So actually there, the identity question is very similar to, again, I say double displacement because for us, when people immigrate, their children have automatically kind of, assimilated into the larger culture there. So until they are young, still the parents are able to influence them, bring them to India, this and this. Then after some point, they just take over their parents' lives and that's it. They have become, amalgamated into the host country, whatever it is, and the parents feel that they are sort of in between. Particularly the language question and all of that, and how does one retain, that in the West and the diaspora, which is now, a question, increasing question also for Tibetans. And finally, losing younger Tibetan talent. I have to say this again and again, there is a lot of talent in the Tibetan community. I feel it's a very different type. I saw this at the Dalai Lama Institute. I feel the student council was extremely active. There is an aesthetic sense and a kind of a, I don't know how to put it, but there's something really very active and fabulous about it. And I also feel though that right now, though it's just may become a question, but there's enough people with talent, Tibetan in India, and maybe of course Nepal, Bhutan. I don't know that the situation there so well. So this is more by way of a bit of a conclusion, but really to open up for questions as well, because this is, the fact that we are having such a discussion at this point is really a sign of a lot of achievement. Because if you think about, the circumstances, the ruthless, economically powerful colonizer and emerging or emerged great power, and the fact that many, really powerful countries also cannot stand up. The fact that the Tibetan community has withstood and continues, without even losing hope, because at times there could be that sort of scenario. And without, I know that some of the younger Tibetans say that, oh, this notion of, smiling, happy, mantra chanting Tibetans, this is a kind of a, caricature and stereotype. And of course, there's a much deeper sense of loss, displacement, all of that. And reading the Tibetan Reader that just came out, you can sense that. But I have to say that, I have not come across bitterness in the refugee community and other things that really could so easily become a part of, one's identity. And that is a real achievement, I feel. I have to give credit to His Holiness the Dalai Lama as, I was working hard since yesterday, so that is a very big error that needs to be connected. He is the personification of modernity and tradition, and again I want to reiterate here that it is extremely rare for somebody who, of course outwardly he is, as he in his own words, a simple Buddhist monk, but he is belonging to a religious, kind of a identity, to see this kind of an inclination towards modernization and true cosmopolitanism. This is something, that I think is really extraordinary. And I was also thinking about it that maybe such figures in history, like, they come along not every so often. Because if you look at his every instinct, it is in the direction of, looking far into the future and cosmopolitanism and a visionary kind of view. Like, for instance, why is he emphasizing on secular ethics, or why is he emphasizing that, monastics engage with science? So, there are many, many things. A religious figure is not going to do that when it undercuts power in their own institutions. So I really feel there that, and also given the personal history at the age at which he does this, and, it's really, and I feel there's everything remains to struggle for in terms of resisting what I now call assimilation by default is what I'm choosing. And that begins with being cognizant of the challenges and the opportunities. And here I also feel that things change in a day, because now we see all the global opposition to China, which might be expedient in some countries in Europe and everything, but at least there's starting to be that. And I think there are opportunities for solidarity with the Uyghurs, other minorities, and now look what is going on. And there I think there needs to just be more, kind of amplifying and a multiplier effect coming together with all these various populations within China and, or claimed by China and the rest of the world that, they are claiming through the BRICS projects and other kinds of things. And I want to say that India has been slow to take advantage of the presence of His Holiness and Tibetans in India. But today there are many younger Tibetans who are interested in, Buddhist philosophy in Tibet, in Tibetans. And I feel that that is an opportunity as well that can be utilized in terms of building up this resistance. So with that, Karen Che, and I'm really sorry if I have said anything here that is totally out of order or not, because as I say, I'm no expert, and this just draws upon, some of my experiences. Thank you.
so much, Kavijila, for very informative presentation about the Tibetan. Once we came into exile, till now under the immense, immeasurable, the gratitude of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, how we become these days, like Tibetans, how the hopeful our Tibetans kind of like identity, or not only identity, culture, Buddhist culture become, like in the, like in the future, and how through that way, how the India and Tibet can be built as, like very resist to the, like assimilation of Tibetan identity and all these things. I'm sure many of the audience will get a lot of information about this. And thank you so much. So without much taking time, I would like to, now this is the question answers time for 10 minutes. So anyone from the floor, please, if you have a question, can I ask to Madam?
Question. I have a question. So one of the last statements you made was that debate with science in monasteries, it's undercutting monasteries' own power. And I want to question that, because it seems to me that since having those science debates with scientists, a lot more people from secular background and people who do not have inclination towards religious thoughts, they have become involved with the debate. And I wonder if that has actually undercut monasteries' power, or maybe broaden the expanded.
Sorry, there I meant the taking of secular ethics, that project, as well as this project of at times not debate per se in the monasteries, but this notion that at the end of the day it was more important to uphold those values and those ideas as opposed to the institutions of religion, that is what I meant by undercutting the power. You are completely right, that debate, and even science, one could feel that, as a person of religion, and that's why Buddhist philosophy is so, modern in its own, or can be harnessed in that direction. You could argue that science will slowly, create skepticism, or there'll be an undercutting of certain areas that were the preserve of religious monasteries per se. And again, I feel the 14th Dalai Lama here is critical, because he could have been one who was always giving wangs, and he he brings you there with that lure maybe, but then he's talking about emptiness and Jangchupsa. And this is the way, the flavor that he has brought to this, position, which is a position of great power, also for other countries, people from there who come for his teachings. I would really welcome, there are some very knowledgeable people in the audience, any pushback or anything that you think, I would really welcome. Is the use of the word assimilation itself in the specific way that I have used, is that something you would agree with or not agree with? And any other questions?
Just a small question. I was wondering if you come across different levels of assimilation in your research. Because I say this because just a naive observation from me that there are Tibetans in diaspora and Tibetans in exile who have different kind of showing their identity. Some of them like wear Tibetan chupa, but they don't speak the language. Some of them, they do speak the language, but not very fluently. So how far will that level of assimilation feature in your research?
Okay. This is a really good question, and something for me to think about. And actually this research, this I have prepared for this talk really. So I have just started thinking about this in the last while before I came here, And I thought hard about, integration in exile as opposed to assimilation. But the reason I have used assimilation by default, as I call it, that in a way maybe it's not by design, in India and other parts of the world, but that, if it continued in a certain direction, or it has the potential to lead to a complete loss of, identity and all. So your point is very well taken, and, yes, that's something to look into. And at this We Are Tibetan, that part of the exhibition here in the Tibet Museum, I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but that captures what you're saying, that the range of what might be considered Tibetan identity in exile is itself very complex and cannot be put down to just one particular.
Yeah, I have a question. Since you have worked with worked in Dalai Lama, the higher education institute as a principal, so I was thinking, what was your greatest achievement while working over there, and also I want to ask you what is the greatest challenge that you face while working with a probably different culture and different, the professional as such. So can you give some?
So let me begin by saying, firstly, how grateful I was for the opportunity. And I say that because, I teach about development or political economy and all of this. And I could have read 1,000 books on being a refugee, but I couldn't understand it the way I did after that experience. So that is the first thing. The second thing is I feel it's to bring in an outsider, a woman, younger, Indian. It is again not common. It would absolutely not happen at an Indian institution or many others. So I was very, very grateful for the opportunity, and what I learned from the 120 students, especially who are coming in from Tibet with no family in India, and generally from Tibetans, as I said about, they kind of, there's a resilience and there's a certain kind of a, I don't know how to put it, but really, one way to say it is put the teachings into practice, another way to say it, okay, even setting that aside, not becoming bitter, not becoming, certain other kinds of things which could so easily be the case. So I think my learning was immense. What I achieved there, I don't know, but I wish I had many more time, and also more kind of, there are structural issues, right? And I've raised them here. And I think, challenges, because my training, both my training, because I spent from 21 to 35 at Cambridge University, and even subsequent to that, Indian institutions have loads of issues and their own kind of, some of them, but then I have kind of worked in institutions somehow where things happen in a certain way, or there's a certain kind of thinking. So I was bringing that element. And I don't know, I think it's my past life imprints of Pacha. I have a great love for Tibetans and a kind of an idealization, which I think perhaps because a lot of non-Tibetans will come to Tibet through His Holiness. So somehow, this notion that everybody is like, just perfect. Of course, in Korba, it's not going to be. So there are issues, and there are, and then for me also, I had not, that way been in administration or, run institutions. It's a very different cup of tea. Now I'm having to also be HOD. This is my ripening karma at the moment to take on those kind of roles. So I think there is learning there, and but as I said, some of the issues that I have put out, there's immense talent at the Dalai Lama Institute. There are excellent teachers in Tibetan studies, and I can name some of that. I think the top scholars there, Gen Kunchokra, Gen Nintha, now Dr. Lamboso has joined. There are and even students, and but there needs to be these. Because like I'm saying, you're traversing many systems, worlds, different, it's not easy. And many times on that Mysore highway, I thought there's Shigatse and there is Birdi. And it makes you think about, what even being a refugee has meant. I know that Tibetans are always very kind, speaking about Indians and our generosity and all, but the fact is, from your extremely beautiful country, to be landed in these situations is also not easy. So I think, when I look at that whole picture, and then some of these points that I have brought out in terms of, that would be areas that could be improved, and, I certainly also, plus I think achieving some of these, it's a bit of a long-term project, So for Tibetans also, the issue is that the horizons are kind of changing and updating, and then, to what degree you can achieve that is also something that takes a lot of time and know.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I don't speak Tibetan, which is extremely sad. I don't know what to do because I'm not very linguistically gifted, so I somehow, that it would have been helpful if I did.
So, ma'am, I have one question. Since you talk about assimilation or by design of the Chinese Communist Party and by default when we came into exile, so whether the assimilation will happen or not, mainly we used to our Tibetan mindsets we have based on the preservation of our very script language. So from 30 years from now, what do you see the Tibetan language will be? How preserved it will be? The status of Tibetan language in the worldwide or so in exile or maybe where will be the status of that?
So I think thus far there's been an excellent job of preserving it, right? As I say, it's preserved in the modern schooling modern systems, and certainly in the traditional systems. There is the preservation of Tibetan language. Going ahead, it will depend on all these forces, the pressures. Like for instance, I never also realized there is a bit of a linguistic hierarchy. Obviously in Tibetans, those who can also speak English, that is an advantage in the modern, ways. Certainly in education systems, there is that sense. And I suppose His Holiness's guidance also that Tibetan monastics, when they get to that point, if they learn English and all this will be advantageous. So then, it depends on the degree to which the community in exile is able to keep up, that the children and even others are able to, both spoken and written. Because written can be stronger. I think written, having engaged with a lot of Tibetan younger people applying to Tibet House Delhi or at the Dalai Lama Institute, the written of both English and I understand Tibetan also. I don't speak it or write it, but I learned from other Genlas that this is a little bit of a problem, amongst the younger generations. So to what degree that can be preserved will depend on, to the question of, I suppose the cognizance, the continuity of these institutions and all of that. And it's critical because I suppose, the language is very central. For any community, I think it's central. In India, I think some communities are much better, like Bengalis only speak Bengali to each other, and generally I still have some friends who even publish academically in Bengali and all in my generation, which is very rare. In the rest of India, you won't have many people publishing in their vernacular language in academic areas and, So I think to whatever degree that can be preserved and maintained will be critical. But thus far, I think it has been. And because of all this effort made.
So, Twin.
Okay, so I think with this we will conclude today's session, and before concluding, I would like to call our director, Mr. Tenzin Dokdinla, to say some few words on the thank you note.
Before I start, can we have a big round of applause to Dr. When I was going through the presentation, so I think I got some few points. So let me reiterate this for the the benefits of the larger audience. So Dr. Kavri started with the very big term, the term that we have been discussing throughout this presentation, assimilation. So the assimilation which you have mentioned by design and by default, but the underpinning, the point here is the critical junction that we are here, the third generation of Tibetan, the exile, the community. So it is us who have this, the way forward. I should say the decision making. On the one hand, Chinese are doing hard to Sinicize the Tibetan inside Tibet, and we in the Exile have all our the communication as well as all our powers to preserve and promote the culture and tradition of Tibet. I think that is one the big thing that we need to take away from this the assimilation that we have been discussing here. And also Kaviriji has beautifully talked about the origin of Tibetan language way back from the 7th century, from the Thimisam Buddha till to the 14th century. I think a lot of our language was primarily driven by the oral tradition, and thereafter from the 14th century, what I heard is what I saw is the invention of the wooden block, printing block that came into existence, right? And then there onward, the language took different shape, and finally what we have witnessed is post 1959, when the Tibetan refugee came to exile in India. The first thing that His Holiness asked to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru is, we have a different language, so can we have a different school to preserve and promote our language and tradition? So I think that is the I should say the paradigm shift, and also the main game changer. From there onward, the preservation, the basic foundation was set up at that time. And then beautifully she talked about the consciously weaving the tradition and modernity in Tibetan education in exile, where she have touched upon the Tibetan education system in great detail, and also touching the monastic the curriculum, and we are very thankful for that. And I think at the end she talked about earlier Indian are very slow in taking advantage of His Holiness Dalai Lama as well as Tibet issue, but right now there is a growing sense of I should say affinity towards this issue. And I must say, Dr. Kaveri Gill, you are the torchbearer in this regard, and you have a lot of potential to bring up a lot of I should say the demographic dividend of this country. And lastly, I would like to thank all the participants to show up in great number and asking great question to her. And finally, we would like to offer scarf. We would like to offer a scarf for you. Thank you so much. And small bouquet of our souvenir. Thank you. And post this, we have tea session at the reception. So please enjoy. And meanwhile, you can ask a lot of formal and informal question there. Yeah. And thank you so much for coming.